Hi, we pick up our story of the journey of the ark in chapter 6, verse 6. We left off last time with the Philistine priests and diviners instructing the Philistines to make images of your tumors or hemorrhoids and of your mice, or maybe that's one thing, and send them to the God of Israel. And so we're going to pick up in verse 6, but I wanted to start back a few verses because verse 6 highlights something that we hadn't seen before that makes us go back a few verses here. So let's look at verse 6, and then we'll look at some of the things that we're continuing to look at as themes throughout this whole section. So in verse 5, we heard the priests and diviners saying to make the images, and they continue to speak in verse 6 and say this surprising thing. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? After he had made fools of them, did they not let the people go and they departed? So suddenly the Philistines know the book of Exodus, or at least some of the story, or maybe they sort of know it. But in doing that, a couple of things happen here. Suddenly, the gold that's been evoked by the Philistines evokes other gold, including the gold that the Israelites took from the Egyptians and then made into golden calf. So let's look at a couple of those images quickly, and then we'll come back to looking at the structure of where we are. So we see in Exodus 32, this classic scene. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Okay. Well, there's a lot of things going on there, and some of that has to do with the separation of Israel and Judah after the reign of Solomon, is where we'll complete this final journey through this when we get somewhere in the book of Kings. But for now, it notes a couple of things. We note that the Philistines are making these little gold objects, but they could easily be seen as idols or gods. They never call them that, but they certainly seem to be offering something in gold that's been cast, much like these calves here. And as we'll see momentarily, the cows that will carry the cart that carries the little golden objects have their calves removed from them. So there's a lot of echoes of the Exodus going on here, and we'll look at that in more detail as we go. So let's return to where we are in the story before we come to look at some of these Exodus and other details up close. So as you see on the right side of the screen, we're continuing our journey through these chapters in 1 Samuel 4 to 6 and the journey of the ark. And so here we are here in chapter 6, where the cow-led ark goes to Beth Shemesh, the house of the sun, and finally settles at the house of Abinadab there, and then that will bring Samuel back on the stage for us. We noted last time that, and it continues to provide details here, that this journey of the ark in 1 Samuel 4 to 6 parallels 2 Samuel 6 in many ways. As you can see, the ark will disappear from the story here at the end of our section here and then suddenly reappear there where it's been all along. It'll make one appearance in 1 Samuel 14, but it's an odd one because it seems to suggest that the ark has been at the house of Abinadab on the hill, and yet in chapter 14 it'll suddenly be available to Saul. But we'll get there when we get there. Another element that we want to look at here is the wordplay on kabod and glory. So we saw last time, 2 times ago, at the end of chapter 4, where the daughter-in-law of Eli at her death and childbirth laments after naming her child Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed. So we see there in the red that the glory is repeated twice. And we're going to see in our section, it was echoed from what we did last time in chapter 5 in terms of it heavy, that God's hand, Yahweh's hand, was heavy and described twice there in terms of kabod, and yet our section here starts off with a double image of give glory to the God of Israel. So make the God of Israel heavy or glorious, or we might say gravitas, but in any event, the question of the glory of God is at issue here, especially odd from the mouth of the Philistines. And I'll put up the map here so we can see that the ark will continue its journey, and we'll see today as it moves from Ekron straight, not moving from right to left, to Beth Shemesh, and then finally ends up in Kiriath Jearim here at the house of Abinadab. So let's look at our text, and we'll see some of these details as we go. So again, returning back here to verse 6, why should you harden your hearts? But that's, of course, not what happened, that the Egyptians and Pharaoh didn't harden their hearts. God hardened their hearts, as you see in this classic image here from Exodus 11:10. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart and did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. We won't get into the details of this now, but but one element that's worth seeing here is that the phrase harden a heart, at least in the Egyptian environment, does not mean to be callous the way we might hear it, as to be unfeeling, but to be resolute. The heart being the place of decision. So to harden one's heart meant to make a decision and stick with it. Here it suggests perhaps something else, that the Philistines' hearts are hardened against acknowledging that Yahweh has power here, something the Egyptians never acknowledge. Then in the second sentence in verse 6 we hear, after he'd made fools of them, did they not let the people go, and they departed? But of course that's exactly what didn't happen, as we just saw, that Pharaoh did not let the people go, and so that leads to the Passover in Exodus 12 and the death of the Egyptian firstborn, and a much more difficult exit than the Philistines are suggesting here. So whether we're to understand the Philistines as having heard rumors of this, or they're not good readers of the other people's scripture, or whatever it is, it's plainly mocking a little bit that the Philistines find themselves ironically in the place of the Israelites, perhaps, if not in the place of the Egyptians here in this story. The word for fool here is an unusual word, ha-telel, different than Nabal, which we'll see is the name of an important character later in 1 Samuel, whose name means fool. So after he had made fools of them or mocked them, did they not let them go, and they departed? But there's no response to that. So it's a rhetorical question that leads to this instruction, and I'll screen up a little bit so we can see this whole section better. So the new RSV has, as you can see now, then get ready a new cart. But the phrase for get ready, kehu va'asu here, which rhymes in Hebrew, is, and in a way we can make it rhyme in English by saying literally take and make a new cart. Rather than getting it ready, perhaps it's suggesting they're actually going to make it, because when the story's over, it's going to be cut into pieces and burned as an offering. So take and make a new cart and 2 milk cows. And something's a little lost in translation there. The Hebrew has consecutively 1 and 2. So 1 cart and 2 cows. The word for milk cows here, for aloth, you see the number of times it's in this section and not elsewhere in the Deuteronomistic history. It's only used elsewhere in the red heifer story in Numbers, and a couple times in prophets, like you see in Amos, where he famously calls the elite women of Israel cows of Bashan on their couches. But here it refers to, the point is nursing cows, and that's going to be very important here, because there's a twist in the plot that's often hidden behind a translation, as we'll see in just a moment. So take the 2 milk cows that have never borne a yoke, so they're wild, they've never been tamed, and yoke the cows to the cart, but take their, not calves, but sons, benahim here, their sons, away from them. And that combination of the nursing cows and their missing sons evokes both Hannah at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where Samuel is taken away from her and consecrated to the Lord in his Nazirite vow that she makes for him and separates him, but also other questions of both the golden calves themselves, although the word is sons here, still the babies of cows would be calves, and even though they're called sons here, it's certainly evoking that. But also the question of the other children who are the sons who are taken away, like Eli's sons who were killed and Samuel's sons who were corrupt, and as we'll see, the question of David's sons eventually, and Saul's sons before that. So there'll be a lot of questions of sons being taken away from people, symbolized here by the cows, taken away from their mothers. So once they take the cows home, the babies home, which there's no apparent reason for doing here otherwise, take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart and put in a box at its side the figurines of gold. There's some translation issues here. Literally, it's take and give. So give it to the cart. It's not a matter of just positioning on the cart. Now the ark belongs to this cart. They're one entity. And the box at its side here, varagez here is, could be translated as saddlebag. It's only 3 times in this passage and not elsewhere in the entire Masoretic text. So it fits as it used elsewhere, that's something hanging off the side of a cart, like a saddlebag. So the ark is in this bag, or sometimes it's translated chest. These figures of gold, they're generically now kele, vessels of gold, referred to later as objects of gold, not described as mice or as hemorrhoids. Maybe they just don't want to say hemorrhoids or tumors out loud, or maybe they're embarrassed by the fact that they're mice, but it was, after all, their idea to make them this way, but they won't name them this way directly. And it's emphasizing the fact that they're simply golden objects, whatever they're shaped as, which also allows more resonance with the golden calves and the gold of Egypt, as well as the gold that becomes part of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that is the companion to the ark in the Exodus story. So you're returning to him as a guilt offering, and this is the return theme that we saw earlier. It's used, the verb shub, the verb shub there used many times throughout this section, as Poulsen has noted, perhaps suggesting the exilic context of these opening chapters after the monarchy has fallen, suggesting that Yahweh alone was ultimately the proper form of leadership for these people. And we'll see more of that in this chapter as we continue here. So send it off and let it go on its way and watch. And we see in verse 9 what the Philistines do is what we might cause a causation versus correlation test. If it goes up on the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, then it is he who has done us this great harm. But if not, then we shall know it is not by his hand that struck us, it happened to us by chance. So the Philistines are being scientific researchers here, testing out their theory that Yahweh is doing this, and they'll find out. A couple of word things to note here. The phrase in its own land, Givelav, is border, and we'll see that echoed in verse 12, which is echoing the Joshua theme of the borders separated out, and here the issue is that Beth Shemesh is in Israel and not in Philistine territory, so the Philistines will watch the cart get there and stop and not enter into Israelite territory at this point. The men did so. They took the milk cows and yoked them to the cart and put the calves at home. And so with the calves, or the sons at home, we'll see what that does to the nursing mother cows. And the cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh, and you can see on the map it is a straight line, along one highway, lowing as they went here. Again, recalling the image of Hannah there. They turn neither to the right or the left, a classic Deuteronomistic phrase here. And let's look at a couple examples of that so we can see how clearly this is a stereotypical expression. So here from Deuteronomy 5:32 we hear, "You must therefore be careful to do as Yahweh your God has commanded you. You shall not turn to the right or to the left." And then a little later in Joshua 23 we hear, "Therefore be very steadfast to observe and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left." And this, of course, echoes the end of Judges negatively, that the people did what was right in their own eyes. So the contrast in choices is to do what's right in one's own eyes, or to look neither to the right or the left because one is following the path laid out by Yahweh in the terms of the covenant, or the law of Moses, as we just heard from Joshua. So the cows are faithful Israelites, neither turning to the right or to the left, and the lords of the Philistines follow them as far as the borders we saw. And then we see the point of view now shift from that of the Philistines to the people of Beth Shemesh, as if the camera is turned around and seen the cart and cows coming to them, while they reap their wheat harvest, which is an unusually specific phrase here. We haven't seen anything else about that's seasonal or suggests any activities that people are doing other than the immediate situation around the ark. And the phrase is unusual here, as you can see. It will come up again, as we see here in 12:17. Is it not the wheat harvest today? And that suggests a time of rejoicing, not surprisingly. And so that's going to echo here into what we see. So while they're engaging in their communal pleasure of getting their food for the season, they look up and see the ark, and they went with rejoicing not to meet it so much, but to see it. So they saw it, and they went with rejoicing to see it, which is to say, to see it up close. So the rejoicing for the wheat harvest is joined here by the rejoicing over the ark appearing in their land. And notice they're not afraid of it like the Philistines were, who just wanted to go from one place to another. The ark is going to find a home with them, although not for everybody, as we'll see. So it comes into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, somebody we don't know otherwise, and it's an interestingly specific thing. This scene here anticipates what we'll see in 11:7, where Saul breaks up a cart and sacrifices oxen after he's been made king. So we'll see that connection there. But in the meantime, it comes into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, who we don't otherwise know, and perhaps it's here to hear his name, because we would hear this if we were listening in Hebrew through English, into the field of Yahweh saves of house of the sun. And that really is the theme of this entire section, isn't it? That it's Yahweh who saves, not the king who they will ask for in a couple of chapters. So this Joshua is echoing of a previous Joshua, as we'll see in Eleazar, echoing a previous Eleazar momentarily. So the cart came into this field of Joshua and stopped there, apparently on its own, having decided that was Yahweh's destination. And a large stone was there, and this is also a curious business here. The English that we see in the RSV misses what you can see in the English, but the connection of the stop there and a large stone was there to theirs. So I was suggesting in the note below this kind of translation, and standing there, and there a great stone. That's more like the Hebrew word order there. So the large stone was there, and then they do something strange. Perhaps strange, they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering. Of course, the Philistines had sent the golden mice or tumors or whatever they are as an offering, but these good Israelites recognize that Yahweh is not interested in idols of gold. And again, perhaps that's a little slap there at the golden calves that they reject, but instead take the cart and the cows themselves and make that the offering. And then they just took the gold objects and put them on the stone, as you see in verse 15, to no apparent end, and there's no future to them. They're just left there on that stone. In fact, when we look at verse 15 and 14 together, you see the burnt offerings to Yahweh at the end of verse 14 and the burnt offerings and sacrifices to Yahweh here, and what the Philistines offered is on the stone in between those burnt offerings. So highlighting the sense that burnt offerings is what Yahweh wants and not little golden mice or tumors. The Philistines misdiagnosing the reality here, getting that it's Yahweh, but misdiagnosing the prescription for the solution here, other than getting the ark out of their territory. And a surprising thing here to us is the Levites appear to take the ark. That's the only time we find the Levites in 1 Samuel, and you see in my note below of 269 times in the Bible. They're only mentioned here, which raises some very interesting questions. Certainly reinforcing the idea that this section is post-exilic, where the Levites are seen a number of times to be carriers of the ark. And as you see even later in the Deuteronomistic history, in my note below, as you see in 2 Samuel 15:24 or in 1 Kings 8:4, when the Levites are mentioned the next two times, it's also associated with carrying the ark. Perhaps that's here that they're substitutes for the family of Eli, who we saw had died and were corrupt. Eli's sons are corrupt. But the Levites are presented here like the audience knows them. And other readers of 1 Samuel would not know them, so it certainly suggests it's for an exilic audience. It would be familiar both with the Exodus story, which we've seen explicitly mentioned here in terms of Egypt, but also the role of Levites as attendants to the ark and to the cult of Yahweh. So there's mentioned here, and then they're forgotten immediately again, and it doesn't stay with the Levites. As we'll see, it'll go to the house of Abinadab. So the people of Beth-Shemesh offer the offerings, and now we again turn to the Philistine perspective. So like a modern novel, the authors switch our perspective back and forth. So we saw how the people of Beth-Shemesh looked out, and now the Philistines standing on the border look out here. We don't know exactly where they're watching from, but it seems to be on the border where they stopped. So they returned that day to Ekron. So you can see again on the map, they stand here on the border of Beth-Shemesh. They realize the ark is gone from them. They're both safe, but also not safe to go invade Israel. And we won't see the Philistines invading again for quite some time. So then the author tells us something that we perhaps wonder, why are we hearing this? This detail of connecting the gold objects with the Philistine cities. And it's so strange it leads some commentators to suggest this is like an appendix or something added later. But again, as Samura notes for us, and we can see the note down below, they say it is an addition because they do not understand how lists are used in biblical narratives. The list in verse 17 is an integral part of the original narrative, and verse 18a is the restatement of the same information in summary form with further detail. Therefore, the initial vav in verse 18 is to be taken as explicative and translated namely, which is to say, in verse 18, the gold tumors, according to the numbers of the cities that they correspond here. So there's only 5 of them. Instead of having 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice, it's suggesting the also here is to say, namely, the gold mice, which is the shape of them. But it could go either way. But either way, it appears that they go distributed to each of the 5 lords of the Philistines, each for one city, underscoring what we saw last time, that the Philistines do not have a king, which the Israelites are about to ask for, but have a ruling council of city bosses, city chiefs, who make decisions as a unit. And that will come up again later when David finds himself working as a mercenary for the Philistines, a surprising twist in the story we'll find much later. So, that it covers not only the cities, but as we see here, the fortified cities and unwalled villages. Again, Samora helps us to hear how this phrase is to go together, to say the entire Philistine territory, not just the 5 cities that you can see on the map, but all the territory in between that is their area. And so the stone, it says, is a witness to this day, whether that's the time of the exile or whenever this author is writing. That phrase "to this day" is used a number of times, though, in the Deuteronomistic history, suggesting, at least to the point of Josiah, for Joshua, Deuteronomy, and for the final outcome, of course, where the monarchy ends with exile. Certainly the authors were writing there from the time of exile. So the stone is there. There's no mention of the 5 golden objects on it, but the stone remains as a witness. What it's a witness to exactly isn't clear, but perhaps it's a border witness, much like Laban and Jacob established a stone as a border witness when Jacob leaves Laban behind with his wives and children back in Genesis. So then really strange things happens as we come toward the end of this. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the New RSV has the descendants of Joconia, but it's literally the men of Joconia. So it's not the people after him, or if Joconia is a person's name or a place. It's not clear either way. It's not in the Hebrew Masoretic text, but taken from the Septuagint. So whether this is a group of people from a place or the people of a family isn't clear. But either way, they refuse to rejoice for reasons that aren't named, and suddenly they're dead. And there's a technical detail about the death, and we don't need to worry about it too much, but the Hebrew suggests 70 of the 50,000, and it leads some translation to say 50,070 or something like that. But plainly, this little town doesn't have 50,000 people. So there was something going on that the scribes who wrote this up put in there that we can't quite figure out. But regardless of the number, the sudden death of 70 people here, which is shocking, and will be echoed into the death of priests by Doeg much later. But here it's not done in terms of a royal competition between Saul and David, but just out of nowhere. Yahweh may have plagued the Philistines, but we didn't hear that suddenly, just for simply not rejoicing, a bunch of people are dead. And as many people have highlighted, including Walter Brueggemann, the ark is not under the control of the Israelites either, which is to say Yahweh cannot be contained. And that certainly says something against even the very Deuteronomistic historians who are writing this, that perhaps Yahweh couldn't be contained in Jerusalem either, couldn't be contained within the monarchy as well. And so one has to be careful. So the people mourned because Yahweh had made a great slaughter among the people. And after the mourning, then the people of Beth Shemesh said, "Who was able to stand before the Lord, this holy God?" The Hebrew is phrased in a way that we could be, who could stand before Yahweh Elohim, the Holy One? But either way, this is an unusual phrase, and they're acknowledging this holiness as set apart, as something terrifying. In the classic Rudolf Otto encounter idea of the holy, of the terrifying tremendum aspect of holiness that can suddenly kill people out of nowhere. So to whom shall he go that we may be rid of him? So having welcomed the ark, now suddenly they realize the violence of it and they want it gone too. So they send messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, which you can see on the map as the final resting place here. Kiriath Jearim meaning forest city, and scholars disagree, as you can see in my notes, whether this counts as within Israel or outside of Israel. You can see it's on the road to Gibeon, which is going to be where Saul is from, and the source of the terrible story at the end of Judges about the killing of the concubine and the dividing up of her body when there was no hospitality in Gibeon. So we're nearing that territory, but it stops here. And so they send messengers there saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the God of your God, Lord, come down and take it." And there's no apparent recognition to the people of Kiriath Jearim of the trouble that the ark has stirred up. So they came and take it and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And we come to the end of our section here with these strange references, because who is this Abinadab on the hill? We don't know. Again, as you can see from the note, as we already saw, it'll still be there in 2 Samuel 6 when David will take it down. But they consecrated, which is to say made holy, the same word as what was just described about this very God that the people of Beth Shemesh want to get rid of the power of. They made holy his son Eleazar, which of course echoes both the son of Aaron, Eleazar, that we saw earlier, but also the death of Eli's son Phinehas, who was a son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, in the earlier part of the story. So a proper priestly name here to take charge of the ark, but we won't hear from him again. And our section closes with this in verse 2. From the day that the ark was lodged here, or sat, at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh. And so there's this time of peace of 20 years of the ark being there, and nothing else, we're told, happens during that time, we hear that all the house of Israel, and usually inclusive phrase because it was elders we heard earlier, or some, and house of Israel will set up here. This is the first time of 8 uses, the question of houses that we'll see with the house of Saul and the house of David throughout both books of Samuel. And why they're lamenting after there's peace isn't exactly clear. Maybe the verb doesn't quite mean that, as the note from Bodner has below. But we hear from another source here, why lament now the ark has been returned? The point is that the people have become aware of a loss of contact with God. So perhaps that's the right answer, or perhaps it's something else. But in any event, with this, Samuel will reappear, and this journey of the ark is over. So we'll pick that up next time as we see the return of Samuel after these comedic, satiric stories of the ark causing hemorrhoids and returning finally led by the milk cows. See you again next time. Bye-bye.